The year is 1066, and the fields of Hastings are drenched in blood and sweat. The air is thick with the clash of swords, the screams of men, and the thunder of charging horses. This is not just any battle, it's the moment that will change the course of history forever. On one side stands Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. On the other, a figure who will become legendary, Duke William of Normandy, a man history will remember as William the Conqueror. This is the day his name is carved into the annals of time, but his story is far stranger, far darker, and far more fascinating than most people realize. Who was William the Conqueror before he became the man who reshaped England? His early life is shrouded in mystery. Born the illegitimate son of a duke, mocked as William the Bastard by his enemies, he clawed his way to power through sheer will and cunning. How did an outsider, a man with no rightful claim, rise to become one of the most feared and respected rulers of the medieval world? And what kind of leader was he really? A visionary who brought order and progress, or a brutal tyrant who crushed resistance beneath his iron boot? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows. This is the story of ambition, betrayal, and an unbreakable will to conquer. It's a tale that stretches from the shadowy halls of Norman castles to the blood-soaked fields of Hastings, a story that echoes even today in the laws, language, and very landscape of England. Over the course of this journey, we'll uncover the secrets of William's rise, the shocking tactics he used to secure his throne, and the legacy that still divides historians. Was he a hero or a villain, a liberator or an oppressor? Stick around, because by the end, you might just see history's most famous conqueror in a whole new light. William's story begins not in triumph but in scandal. Born in 1028 at Falaise Castle, he entered the world as the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy and a woman named Herleva. Some accounts say she was the daughter of a tanner, others claim she was a nobleman's mistress, but one thing was certain: young William carried the stain of his birth from the very beginning. In a world where bloodlines meant power, he was mockingly called William the Bastard, a name that would fuel both his insecurities and his iron determination. But illegitimacy wasn't his only challenge. When William was just 7 years old, his father left on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a journey he would never return from. Suddenly, this boy, already an outsider, was thrust into the dangerous game of Norman politics as the heir to a duchy he wasn't even supposed to inherit. It didn't take long for the wolves to circle. Noblemen who saw him as weak, unworthy, or simply in their way plotted to remove him permanently. One night, assassins broke into the home where William was staying. His guardians were murdered in their beds, but the young duke narrowly escaped, hidden by loyal servants who smuggled him to safety under cover of darkness. Imagine that, a child hunted like prey, learning the brutal lesson that trust could get you killed. It's no surprise he grew up with a hardened heart and a mind sharpened by survival. Every betrayal, every whisper behind his back, every attempt on his life only deepened his resolve. If legitimacy wouldn't give him power, he would take it by force. By the time he was a teenager, William had already begun silencing his enemies with a mix of cunning and sheer brutality. He wasn't just fighting for a title, he was fighting to prove that a bastard could outthink, outfight, and outlast every noble-born rival who underestimated him. This wasn't just ambition, it was personal, and it shaped the ruthless leader who would one day stare across the battlefield at Hastings, knowing that defeat meant oblivion. The boy who dodged assassins in the night would become the man who changed England forever. But first, he had to conquer Normandy itself. Surviving those early years required more than just luck. It demanded alliances, and William learned fast that even a boy duke could be useful to powerful men. His great-uncle, Archbishop Robert of Rouen, became a crucial protector, using the church's influence to shield him from noble factions eager to tear Normandy apart. But the church's support came with strings attached. William would grow up understanding that power was never given freely, only borrowed. Then came the turning point, the rebellion of 1047. Nobles who had spent years chipping away at William's authority finally made their move, betting the young duke would crumble under pressure. But William, now 19, wasn't the helpless child they remembered. With backing from King Henry I of France, he marched against the rebels at the Battle of Hastings. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a message. The French king hadn't intervened out of kindness. He saw William as a pawn to keep Normandy weak. But William turned the tables, using Henry's support to crush his enemies while proving he was no one's puppet. The aftermath was brutal. Traitors were executed, lands confiscated, and the remaining nobles faced a stark choice: swear loyalty or vanish. William didn't just reclaim his duchy, he remade it in his image, forging a new aristocracy bound to him personally. Yet even as he tightened his grip, the whispers never stopped. The bastard might rule Normandy, but some wounds never fully heal, and that lingering doubt, the sense that he still had something to prove, would fuel everything he did next. His survival wasn't just luck or sheer force, it was a masterclass in political cunning. Every assassination attempt, every betrayal taught him the same lesson: trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. By the time he turned 20, William had outmaneuvered enemies inside and outside Normandy, but his greatest challenge still lay ahead across the English Channel, where a crown awaited. And this time he wouldn't be fighting for survival, he'd be fighting for a throne. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a victory, it was the proving ground where William transformed from a hunted boy into a warrior duke. At 19, facing rebel barons who thought him weak, he didn't just fight, he rewrote the rules of Norman warfare. While most medieval battles were chaotic brawls, William's forces moved with precision, his cavalry striking like a hammer against an anvil. The rebels, expecting disarray, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. By day's end, the fields ran red with the blood of traitors, and Normandy had its answer. The so-called bastard was now its undisputed master. But William wasn't content with mere survival. He hungered for more, starting with Maine, the rebellious county south of Normandy. In 1051, he launched a campaign that showcased his genius for psychological warfare. Instead of rushing headlong into battle, he starved castles into submission, used feigned retreats to lure enemies into traps, and turned rival nobles against each other with promises and threats. His most infamous tactic, the scorched earth strategy, when the city of Alençon mocked his low birth, hanging animal hides over its walls to taunt his Tanner ancestry, William responded with chilling efficiency. He captured the town, severed the hands and feet of 32 captives, and hurled them over the walls. The message was clear: defiance meant annihilation. By the time Maine fell, William's reputation had spread far beyond Normandy. Kings and counts whispered of a commander who fought not just with swords but with his mind. His cavalry, trained to charge in disciplined formations, became the terror of Europe. Unlike other lords who led from the rear, William rode at the front, his presence electrifying his troops. Chroniclers wrote of a man who seemed to sense weakness like a predator exploiting hesitation, turning betrayal into advantage and leaving rivals with no choice but submission or death. Yet for all his brutality, there was cunning beneath the violence. William understood that fear alone couldn't hold a kingdom. After crushing rebellions, he'd offer pardons to those who knelt, binding them to him with oaths and marriages, weaving a web of loyalty as strong as any fortress wall. By 30, he'd forged Normandy into a war machine, its knights the envy of Christendom. But his greatest weapon wasn't his army, it was his patience. While others rushed to claim crowns, William waited, watched, and let his enemies underestimate him one last time. Across the Channel, England's throne was slipping into chaos. And the bastard of Normandy was ready to make it his own. Marriage in medieval Europe was never just about love. It was power, politics, and survival. and in 1051 William made a move that would reshape his destiny. He sought the hand of Matilda of Flanders, daughter of Count Baldwin V, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. This wasn't just a romantic alliance, it was a masterstroke. Flanders controlled trade routes, had ties to the French crown, and could supply the wealth and soldiers William needed to secure his growing ambitions. But there was one glaring problem: they were cousins. The church forbade marriages between relatives, and Pope Leo IX condemned the union, but William wasn't about to let a papal decree stand in his way. For years he defied Rome, refusing to annul the marriage even as threats of excommunication loomed. Why risk divine wrath? Because Matilda brought something more valuable than the church's blessing: legitimacy. Her noble blood diluted the stain of his illegitimacy, and her family's influence gave him a foothold in the tangled web of European politics. It took until 1059 for the Pope to finally relent, but by then the marriage had already borne fruit both in children and in power. Yet the most intriguing part of this story isn't the politics, it's the legend. Chroniclers wrote that Matilda initially refused William's proposal, scornful of his bastard status. Enraged, he allegedly rode to Flanders, burst into her chambers, dragged her by her hair, and threw her to the ground. Whether this actually happened is debated. Some say it's a myth, others a twisted romantic tale. But the symbolism is hard to ignore. William, the man who'd spent his life fighting for respect, wouldn't take no for an answer, even from a princess. What's undeniable is their partnership. Matilda wasn't just a passive pawn, she ruled Normandy in William's absence, funded his campaigns, and even commissioned the famous Bayeux tapestry. Together, they built a dynasty, but every alliance came at a cost. The same determination that forged their marriage would later drive William across the Channel toward a crown that would test the limits of his ambition and his ruthlessness. Picture this: the year is 1064, 2 years before Hastings, in the Grand Hall of a Norman castle. Harold Godwinson, England's most powerful earl, a man who would one day wear its crown, stands before William of Normandy, surrounded by flickering torchlight and the silent weight of holy relics. The air is thick with tension, ambition, and unspoken threats. What unfolds next isn't just a meeting, it's a trap, a masterstroke of political theater that will give William everything he needs to justify invasion. According to Norman chroniclers, Harold had been shipwrecked on the coast of Ponthieu, seized by a local lord, and rescued by William, though rescue in this case meant being held as an honored guest who couldn't leave. Then came the oath. William, ever the strategist, presented Harold with a choice: swear allegiance over sacred relics, publicly supporting his claim to England's throne, or risk never seeing his homeland again. The relics weren't just symbols, they were bones of saints, objects so holy that breaking an oath sworn upon them meant eternal damnation. Did Harold, desperate to return home, reluctantly agree? Or was this entire story crafted later by William's propagandists to paint Harold as an oath-breaker? The accounts vary wildly. The Bayeux tapestry, a piece of Norman propaganda stitched with threads of triumph, depicts Harold solemnly placing his hands on the relics, his face unreadable. But Anglo-Saxon sources barely mention the event, if at all. Here's what we do know: William never forgot that oath. When Harold took England's crown after Edward the Confessor's death in 1066, William didn't just see betrayal, he saw opportunity. To Europe's Christian rulers, Harold's alleged perjury transformed William from an ambitious duke into an avenger of divine justice. The Pope himself blessed William's invasion, sending a papal banner that turned his army into holy crusaders. But let's peel back the layers. Was this really about a broken promise, or was it about something far older? William's unshakable belief that power belonged to those bold enough to seize it. The oath gave him legitimacy, but his ships, his soldiers, and his ruthless determination would do the rest. Hastings wasn't just a battle for a throne. It was the collision of two men's fates, set in motion by an oath sworn in shadows, one that history would remember as the spark that set England ablaze. By 1065, William's ambition had crystallized into a single, staggering goal: the conquest of England. But crossing the Channel wasn't just a matter of loading soldiers onto boats. It required an operation of unprecedented scale, one that would test Normandy's resources to their limits. First came the ships. 700 vessels, each hand-built from freshly felled timber, began taking shape along the Normandy coast. Forests vanished as craftsmen worked day and night, shaping hulls strong enough to withstand autumn storms and shallow enough to land on English beaches. The scale was staggering enough to carry thousands of men, horses, and siege engines across treacherous waters. This wasn't just a fleet, it was a floating war machine, the largest amphibious invasion force Europe had seen since Roman times. Then came the army. William knew Norman troops alone wouldn't be enough, so he turned the invasion into a continental enterprise. Knights from Brittany, Flanders, and even distant Burgundy answered his call, lured by promises of English land and plunder. Mercenaries, hardened fighters with no loyalty but to gold, swelled the ranks, but the real masterstroke was how William financed it all. He mortgaged his own duchy, pledging castles and titles as collateral to fund weapons, armor, and supplies. Every sword, every barrel of salted meat, every ounce of iron for arrowheads was accounted for. This wasn't just preparation, it was a gamble with everything on the line. Yet ships and soldiers were only part of the equation. William needed something more powerful than steel: legitimacy. That's where the church came in. By framing Harold's broken oath as a sin against God himself, William convinced Pope Alexander II to bless his campaign. The papal banner sent to Normandy wasn't just clothes, it transformed William's army into holy warriors, their invasion a crusade to punish a usurper. Imagine the psychological impact. As William's fleet set sail, his men truly believed heaven was on their side. But nature had other plans. For weeks, unrelenting winds pinned the invasion force in port, straining supplies and morale. Meanwhile, in England, Harold's army stood ready, watching the coast. The delay nearly broke William's campaign before it began, until at last the winds shifted. On September 27, 1066, the Normans crossed the Channel under cover of darkness, their ships cutting through the waves like arrows loosed from fate's own bow. The conquest of England had begun, but the true test, the blood-soaked fields of Hastings, still lay ahead. Dawn broke on October 14, 1066, but for King Harold's Anglo-Saxon army there had been no rest. Just 19 days earlier, they'd marched nearly 200 miles north to annihilate Viking invaders at Stamford Bridge, a staggering victory that had left them bloodied, exhausted, and utterly unprepared for the new threat now lining the hills of Hastings. William's Norman forces, fresh from their Channel crossing, had spent 2 weeks fortifying their position, while Harold's men stumbled south with blistered feet and dwindling supplies. The stage was set for a clash that would hinge not just on strength, but on stamina, strategy, and a single moment of deception that would echo through the centuries. The battle began with a thunderous Norman advance, archers loosing volleys of arrows, infantry crashing into the Saxon shield wall. But Harold's housecarls, battle-hardened and disciplined, held firm. Their wall of interlocked shields was like a living fortress, absorbing each assault with grim determination. William's cavalry, usually unstoppable, found themselves floundering against the bristling spears and axes of the English line. By midday, the Normans were faltering. Rumors spread that William had fallen, and panic threatened to unravel his army. Then, in a move that would define his legacy, William tore off his helmet, rode through the ranks, and roared, "Look at me. I live, and by God's help I will conquer." The sight of their duke, bloodied but unbowed, rallied his men, but the real masterstroke was yet to come. As afternoon's shadows lengthened, William's forces executed a tactic that would become legendary: the feigned retreat. A portion of his cavalry suddenly broke ranks, fleeing in apparent disarray. To the exhausted Saxons, it seemed like victory was within grasp. dozens abandoned the safety of the shield wall, charging downhill in pursuit, only to find themselves ambushed by Norman knights who wheeled around and cut them down. The shield wall, once impregnable, now had fatal gaps, and then came the moment that changed everything. Amid the chaos, an arrow, whether by chance or fate, found its mark. The Bayeux tapestry immortalizes the scene, Harold clutching his face, an arrow piercing his eye. Norman chroniclers insist he was struck down by William's own knight shortly after, his body so mutilated that only his lover could identify him by secret marks. With their king dead, the Saxon resistance crumbled. By nightfall, the field belonged to William and England's fate was sealed. But Hastings wasn't just a battle, it was a brutal lesson in the cost of overconfidence. Harold, the victor of Stamford Bridge, had underestimated the Normans' endurance and cunning. William, the bastard duke, had turned near defeat into triumph through sheer will and ruthless ingenuity. The world would never see England the same way again. The last Anglo-Saxon king lay dead on the soil he'd fought to protect, while the Conqueror stood at the threshold of a new era, one built on blood, broken oaths, and the unshakable belief that power belonged to those bold enough to take it. The crown may have been won at Hastings, but keeping it would require an entirely different kind of warfare, one not fought on open battlefields, but in scorched earth and starving villages. In 1069, just 3 years after his victory, William faced the greatest threat to his rule yet, a roaring, coordinated rebellion across northern England, backed by Danish invaders and Saxon lords who refused to bow to Norman rule. The response would become infamous as the Harrying of the North, a campaign so brutal that chroniclers wrote of corpses littering roads and survivors reduced to eating dogs, rats, even human flesh. This wasn't just suppression, it was annihilation. William's strategy was methodical and merciless. He divided his army into small, mobile units, each tasked with a single objective: erase all means of survival. Fields of grain were torched before harvest, livestock were slaughtered or driven off. Villages burned so completely that decades later, the Domesday book would record vast swaths of Yorkshire as waste. But the true horror lay in the aftermath. With no food stores or seed for planting, famine spread like a shadow. Contemporary accounts describe desperate families abandoning starved children by roadsides, their skeletal hands clutching empty bowls. Some estimates suggest 100,000 perished, a staggering toll in an era when England's entire population hovered around 2 million. What makes the harrying so chilling isn't just the scale of destruction, but its precision. This wasn't random violence, it was psychological warfare. By targeting the very land that sustained life, William didn't merely defeat rebels, he shattered the will to resist. Survivors were left with an unspoken lesson. Defiance meant watching your children wither to bones. The Danes, who'd hoped to exploit the uprising, withdrew rather than face an enemy willing to scorch his own kingdom. Even the church, typically silent on royal brutality, condemned the campaign. Archbishop Ealdred of York died of grief within months, his heartbroken pleas for mercy ignored. Yet for William, the ends justified the means. The North never rebelled again. Norman castles rose over the ashes, their stone walls a constant reminder of the price of resistance. But whispers of his cruelty lingered, staining his legacy. Was this the act of a pragmatic ruler securing his throne, or a tyrant reveling in vengeance? The scars on the land told their own story. Villages that once thrived vanished from maps entirely. For generations, the North bore the mark of the Conqueror's wrath, a silent testament to the cost of crossing a man who'd spent his whole life proving that no insult, no challenge would ever go unanswered. Standing on the banks of the Thames, the White Tower wasn't just a castle, it was a declaration etched in stone. When William ordered its construction in 1078, he wasn't merely building a fortress, he was crafting a weapon of psychological domination. Imagine the shock of London's Saxon inhabitants as this colossal structure rose. its pale, keen stone gleaming unnervingly against the soot-stained city. At 90 feet tall, it dwarfed every other building in England, a physical manifestation of Norman superiority. But this wasn't just about height. Every architectural choice whispered threats. The walls, 11 feet thick at the base, defied any notion of rebellion. The single entrance, accessible only by a removable wooden staircase, screamed control, enter only with permission. Inside, the symbolism grew darker. The ground floor housed William's personal armory, an arsenal so vast it could equip hundreds on demand. Above it, the Grand Hall doubled as a throne room and a courtroom where the Conqueror dispensed justice with ruthless efficiency. But the true stroke of genius lay in the chapel of St. John the Evangelist. Placed conspicuously on the second floor, it forced visitors to walk past racks of weapons and armored guards before reaching a space of worship. The message was unmistakable. God and the crown were now one, and both would be defended with steel. Yet the tower's most terrifying feature was what it lacked: windows at street level. To Londoners passing by, the lower floors presented an impenetrable blank face, offering no glimpse of life within. This wasn't just security, it was theater of the macabre. Whispers spread of prisoners dragged through underground passages, of dungeons where men vanished into silence. Whether these stories were true mattered less than their effect. Fear became the mortar holding the regime together. For William, the White Tower was the ultimate hybrid of palace and propaganda. Its sheer scale humbled visitors, its defenses mocked attackers, and its very presence rewrote London's skyline in Norman French. But perhaps its most sinister achievement was how it transformed oppression into permanence. Unlike the temporary horror of the harrying of the North, this structure was built to endure, a daily, inescapable reminder that resistance was futile. When the stones outlast the screams, history belongs to the conquerors. Imagine a kingdom where the king knows not just who owns every field and mill, but how many pigs graze in each woodland, how many fish swim in every pond, and even which peasant owes him a handful of eggs each year. This wasn't some dystopian fantasy, it was reality in 11th century England, thanks to William the Conqueror's most chillingly efficient weapon, the Domesday Book. In 1086, 20 years after Hastings, William faced a problem. Rebellions had been crushed, castles built, but his grip on England required more than fear, it required knowledge. So he unleashed an army not of soldiers but of scribes. These royal commissioners fanned out across the land, holding local courts where terrified villagers were interrogated under oath. Every acre of farmland, every ox, every plough was recorded with meticulous precision. The scope was staggering: over 13,000 settlements catalogued, from bustling towns to remote hamlets. And this wasn't some passive survey. Communities that lied or held back information faced brutal fines. The message was clear: resistance was impossible when the crown knew everything. But the Domesday Book wasn't just about taxes, it was about rewriting history itself. By documenting pre-conquest landholdings alongside current ones, William legally erased Anglo-Saxon claims to property. A Saxon Then's descendants searching for proof of their stolen inheritance would find only cold ink declaring it now belonged to some Norman baron. The past had been not just conquered but bureaucratically erased. What makes this document so revolutionary is its sheer modernity. This was medieval big data, a centralized database that allowed William to squeeze maximum wealth from his realm. Need funds for a new war? The Domesday Book showed exactly which regions could bear higher taxes. Suspect a lord of hiding resources, the records exposed discrepancies. For the first time in European history, a ruler had real-time economic intelligence at his fingertips. And here's the haunting part: nearly 1,000 years later, historians still use it. The Domesday Book survives today in London's National Archives, its parchment pages offering an unparalleled snapshot of medieval life. From the names of long-dead farmers to the locations of vanished villages, it's a time capsule written in the ink of conquest. But beneath the dry entries lies a darker truth. This wasn't just administration. It was control perfected, proving that William understood what many modern governments still grapple with. Information is power, and power, when finely detailed, becomes inescapable. History remembers conquests by their battlefields, but the true reshaping of England happened in silent rooms where Norman lords replaced Saxon thegns, where French became the language whispered in courts, and where the very fabric of society was unraveled thread by thread. Within 2 decades of Hastings, 95 out of every 100 Anglo-Saxon nobles had vanished, exiled, executed, or reduced to peasants tilling lands their families once ruled. Their estates now belonged to William's loyal Normans, men who built castles not just as fortresses but as permanent statements of dominance. This wasn't merely regime change, it was an erasure. Take the language of power. In the halls of justice, in the courts of kings, even in the marketplace, French words slithered into English like a slow-moving tide. The animal grazing in the field kept its Saxon name, cow, but the meat on a Norman lord's plate became a beef, from the French boeuf. The peasant who tended pigs called them by their old English name, but the aristocracy dined on pork, from pork. Language became a caste system, etching inequality into every conversation. Even today, the duality persists, proof that William's conquest didn't just change rulers, it rewired the very way English people thought. Then came the legal revolution. The Anglo-Saxon tradition of local shire courts where freemen could voice grievances was supplanted by a top-down Norman system. William's sheriffs, answerable only to the crown, enforced laws designed to centralize power. Trial by combat, a brutal Norman import, replaced older customs like trial by ordeal. And the forest laws, they were perhaps the most hated innovation of all. Vast swaths of land were declared royal hunting grounds where peasants faced mutilation or death for killing deer to feed starving families. The message was clear: the land belonged to the Normans now, down to the last leaf and hoofbeat. Even the church wasn't spared. Saxon bishops were deposed, their seats handed to Norman appointees who answered to Rome and the crown. Canterbury Cathedral, the heart of English Christianity, was rebuilt in soaring Norman arches, its Saxon foundations literally buried beneath foreign stone. Monasteries that had preserved Anglo-Saxon culture for centuries saw their libraries purged, their chronicles rewritten to glorify the new order. Yet nowhere was the transformation more visible than in the landscape itself. Before William, England had barely a handful of castles. By the time of his death, over 500 motte and bailey fortresses prickled the countryside, each a grim reminder of who held power. These weren't just military bases, they were instruments of terror. Built on hilltops overlooking Saxon villages, their wooden palisades later replaced by stone, they loomed like sentinels ensuring obedience. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lamented their rise with bitter poetry. They filled the land with castles, oppressing the wretched people. What's chilling is how systematic it all was. This wasn't the chaotic pillaging of earlier invasions. William didn't just conquer England, he methodically dismantled and reassembled it, brick by brick, word by word, law by law. By the time the Domesday book was complete, the England of Alfred the Great and Harold Godwinson existed only in whispers, a ghost beneath the parchment of Norman clerks. The people might still speak English in their hovels, but in the halls of power, in the courts, in the very stones of their cities, the conqueror's shadow stretched long and unyielding. Some call it progress, others call it cultural genocide, but one thing's certain: when William died in 1087, he left behind a nation unrecognizable to those who'd been born in it, a hybrid creature, half Saxon, half Norman, forever bearing the scars of its making. Before William, land in England was a patchwork of ancient rights and inherited claims, where Saxon earls held power passed down through generations. But the Conqueror saw this decentralized system as a weakness, one he would replace with a rigid new order imported from Normandy, feudalism. At its core was a simple, ruthless idea. Every scrap of land in England now belonged to the crown. Not just symbolically, but in practice. Forests, fields, even the villages themselves became royal property, leased back to lords under terms that turned the entire kingdom into a pyramid of controlled obligations. The mechanics were brutally efficient. William parceled out conquered territories to his most trusted Norman barons, but with strings tighter than a bowstring. In exchange for estates, each lord had to swear an oath of loyalty directly to the king and provide a set number of mounted knights for military service, usually about 40 days per year. These barons then subdivided their lands to lesser knights who swore similar oaths downward in an unbreakable chain of dependence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle paints a grim picture. He gave his lands on hard terms. The richest had to pay him in gold and silver, the poorest in yearly crops. For the first time, ownership wasn't hereditary right but conditional privilege. But William didn't stop at military service. He weaponized the feudal contract to prevent any lord from becoming too powerful. Estates were scattered geographically. A baron might hold manors in Yorkshire, Kent, and Devon, making it impossible to concentrate regional power. Castles could only be built with royal permission, and every sheriff answered directly to the crown. Even inheritance was controlled. When a lord died, his heir had to pay a hefty relief fee to reclaim the family lands. Refuse, and your estates reverted to the king. The genius and cruelty of this system lay in its flexibility. William could reward loyalty with land one day and strip it away the next. After the 1075 revolt of the earls, he confiscated vast holdings from traitors with a stroke of a pen, redistributing them to obedient vassals. The Domesday book later formalized this control, cataloging every estate's value so the crown knew exactly what it could seize or tax. For ordinary Saxons, the change was catastrophic. Freemen who'd once owned small plots now found themselves villeins, bound to the land as serfs. Their labor wasn't their own. They owed days of work each week on the lord's personal fields, plus a share of their harvest. The old concept of folkland, communal fields managed by villages, vanished under Norman surveyors' ink. Even the forests became oppressive. William's harsh forest laws criminalized hunting, turning once common practices into offenses punishable by blinding. Yet for all its brutality, Norman feudalism brought unexpected stability. The clear hierarchy reduced internal warfare. No more squabbling Saxon earls raiding each other's borders. The knight service system created a standing army without the cost of permanent salaries, and by tying land to military obligation, William ensured England could be defended against Viking or French threats. Historians still debate whether this was progress or oppression, but one thing's certain: the feudal revolution didn't just redistribute land, it redefined English identity itself, forging a society where loyalty to the crown outweighed blood, tradition, or even justice. William's conquest wasn't just about land or lords, it reached into the very soul of England, reshaping its spiritual life with the same ruthlessness he applied to its fields and fortresses. The church, once a sanctuary of Anglo-Saxon culture, became another frontier for Norman control. Within years of Hastings, every English bishopric save one had a foreign face behind its altar. Saxon clergy were swept aside, their places filled by Norman appointees who answered not just to God, but to the crown. At the center of this transformation stood Lanfranc, the Italian-born scholar William installed as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070. A brilliant administrator with a reputation for unshakable loyalty, Lanfranc didn't just reform the English church, he weaponized it. The changes were both subtle and staggering. Latin replaced Old English in religious services, severing commoners from understanding the liturgy. Saxon saints' feast days were quietly erased from calendars, their shrines stripped of relics. Even the physical spaces were remade. Grand Romanesque cathedrals, built in the Norman style, rose where humble Saxon churches once stood. But the most consequential shift was in power dynamics. Before William, Anglo-Saxon kings had consulted with bishops. Now, bishops were effectively royal appointees. When Lanfranc held synods, their decrees echoed William's policies, blurring the line between spiritual and secular authority. The church became an extension of the state, its hierarchy mirroring the feudal system. Abbots and bishops held their offices as fiefs, owing military service like any baron. Yet this fusion of cross and crown carried seeds of future strife. By asserting control over clerical appointments, William laid the groundwork for a conflict that would rage for centuries: the investiture controversy. Popes like Gregory VII would later demand that only the church could appoint bishops, sparking wars across Europe. Though William's iron grip kept tensions at bay in his lifetime, the precedent he set entangled English kings in bitter struggles with Rome for generations. Even Lanfranc, for all his loyalty, occasionally bristled at royal overreach, hinting at the fault lines beneath the surface. What's often overlooked is how this religious overhaul affected ordinary believers. Saxon monks who'd spent lifetimes copying gospels in intricate insular script now found their work dismissed as barbaric. Local priests, once community leaders, became subordinates to French-speaking superiors. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, himself of mixed Saxon-Norman heritage, wrote of elderly nuns weeping as unfamiliar chants echoed through rebuilt convents. This wasn't just a change of leadership, it was a cultural severing, one that left many feeling spiritually orphaned in their own land. William's church reforms reveal the paradox of his rule. He sought divine legitimacy even as he bent sacred institutions to his will. When he commissioned the Domesday book, church lands were scrutinized as coldly as any manor. When he needed funds, he didn't hesitate to tax abbeys or leave bishoprics vacant to pocket their income. The same man who wept at his coronation, swearing to protect the English church, would later depose an Archbishop of York for daring to assert independence. In the end, William's relationship with the church mirrored his conquest: total, uncompromising, and etched in stone. The Norman cathedrals still standing today aren't just monuments to faith, they're fingerprints of a king who believed even heaven should bow to his command. For a man who spent his life conquering kingdoms, William's greatest battles often came from within his own family. His marriage to Matilda of Flanders had been a political masterstroke, but it was also a genuine partnership rare for its time. While William waged war in England, Matilda ruled Normandy with a steady hand, crushing dissent, managing finances, and even commissioning ships for his invasions. She wasn't just a placeholder, she was a co-ruler in all but name, her seal appearing on documents alongside his. Yet even this formidable alliance couldn't shield them from the fractures that tore at their children. Their eldest son, Robert Curthose, was both heir and heartbreak. Gifted with charm but lacking his father's tactical brilliance, Robert grew resentful of William's tight grip on power. When the king refused to grant him independent control of Normandy, rebellion simmered. In 1079, Robert's discontent exploded into open warfare. The irony was cruel. William, who'd fought so hard to secure his birthright, now faced armies led by his own flesh and blood. At the siege of Gerberoy, father and son clashed swords directly in a melee so vicious that William was unhorsed and nearly killed by Robert's own lance. The Conqueror survived, but the wound went deeper than flesh. This was betrayal written in steel. The younger sons watched these clashes with wary eyes. William Rufus, the middle child, shared his father's ruthless ambition but none of Robert's rebellious streak. He became William's favored successor for England, a choice that stoked bitter jealousy. Then there was Henry, the youngest, a scholar with a calculating mind who bided his time, knowing dynasties often rewarded patience over valor. The family dinners at Rouen must have been tense affairs, with Robert glaring across the table at brothers he suspected of plotting his disinheritance. Matilda's loyalties were torn. She secretly sent funds to Robert during his exile, a move William never forgave. When she died in 1083, the fragile balance shattered completely. The king grew more paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow, including his own blood. On his deathbed in 1087, William would make one final, fateful decision: Normandy to Robert, England to Rufus and to Henry. Only a handful of silver and a prophecy. You will get everything your brothers lose. It was a division designed to weaken them all, ensuring none could rival his own legacy. Even in death, the conqueror couldn't stop conquering, playing his sons against each other like pieces on a chessboard, forever haunted by the fear that family, like everything else in his life, would have to be controlled through force. The Siege of Mantes in 1087 should have been another footnote in William's relentless campaigns, a minor skirmish to punish French raiders who'd burned Norman villages. But fate had other plans. As flames consumed the town's wooden buildings, William's warhorse suddenly reared, slamming the iron pommel of his saddle into his gut with such force that it ruptured his intestines. The pain would have been unbearable, the injury grotesque, yet even as blood pooled internally, the conqueror refused to retreat, ordering his men to press the attack while he writhed in agony. By the time they carried him back to Rouen, infection had set in, and the man who'd survived a lifetime of battles was now dying by inches from a wound no enemy blade had inflicted. The circumstances were suspicious enough to spark whispers. Was this truly an accident or something darker? William had spent decades making enemies, from dispossessed Saxon lords to betrayed Norman barons, even his own rebellious son Robert. The timing was uncanny. Just months earlier, King Philip I of France had taunted William about his obesity, joking that the conqueror was lying in like a pregnant woman. Some chroniclers hinted the saddle had been tampered with, its pommel weakened to break under pressure. Others pointed to William's own deteriorating health. At 59, his once powerful frame had grown so heavy that servants reportedly had to roll him into bed. Yet even in decline, he remained a target. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, never one to mourn the conqueror, noted dryly that the French were glad of his suffering. What followed was a death as dramatic as his life. For 6 weeks, William lingered in the priory of St. Gervais, his body rotting from within. As the stench of gangrene filled the chamber, even his physicians fled. The man who'd once terrified Europe now lay helpless, dictating final wishes between screams. His last act was to divide his empire, Normandy for Robert, England for William Rufus, a decision that guaranteed the very civil wars he'd spent his life preventing. When death finally came on September 9, 1087, the aftermath was as chaotic as the man himself. Servants stripped his bloated corpse naked, looters plundered his belongings, and his funeral at Keene became a grotesque farce when his body, too large for the prepared tomb, burst open during the burial, filling the church with a stench so vile mourners ran retching into the streets. Historians still debate whether William's death was foul play or freak misfortune. The truth may be both. In an age where assassinations often came disguised as accidents, loosened saddle straps, poisoned gloves, the line between malice and mishap was thin. But perhaps the greatest irony is that William, who'd built an empire on control, met his end through the one thing he couldn't command: chance. The saddle that killed him wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was a symbol of the horsemanship that made Norman knights invincible. That the conqueror's own weapon became his undoing feels less like an accident and more like fate's final, brutal joke. Even in death, William refused to go quietly. His funeral at the Abbey of St. Etienne in Keene was meant to be a solemn affirmation of his piety, a final act of penance from the warrior who'd built the abbey years earlier to atone for marrying his cousin. Instead, it became a grotesque spectacle that seemed ripped from a morality play. As bishops and nobles gathered to pay their respects, they were met with a horror no chronicler could resist recording. The conqueror's body, swollen from weeks of untreated infection, had grown so monstrously bloated that it refused to fit into the prepared stone sarcophagus. When attendants tried forcing the corpse into the tomb, the distended abdomen burst open with a sickening rupture, releasing a flood of putrid fluids that drenched the clergy and sent nobles retching into their sleeves. The stench clung to the church for days, a visceral reminder that not even kings could escape decay. Monks who witnessed the scene saw divine symbolism in the disaster. Orderic Vitalis, the Norman chronicler, wrote that the bursting corpse mirrored William's own swollen pride, a man who'd conquered too much and ruled too harshly, now literally too large for his mortal confines. Even the funeral procession had been haunted by omens. A local peasant interrupted the ceremony, claiming the land for the abbey had been stolen from his father, forcing William's son Henry to compensate him on the spot. To medieval minds, these weren't coincidences, they were God's verdict on a reign built on broken oaths and bloodshed. Yet there's a darker, more practical explanation. The 6-week delay between William's death and burial necessary to transport his body from Rouen to Keene had allowed decomposition to accelerate unchecked. Without modern embalming, even royal corpses succumbed rapidly, especially one ravaged by gangrene. The real scandal wasn't divine judgment but human negligence. William's own barons, perhaps eager to see the tyrant gone, had rushed the burial without proper preparation. Even his tombstone, commissioned years earlier, bore an inscription that now rang hollow. He who was once a mighty king and lord of many a land now holds but 7 feet of ground. The irony is overwhelming. The man who'd reshaped England's landscape with castles and cathedrals couldn't control his own final resting place. The same meticulous planning that orchestrated the Domesday Book and the Norman invasion failed to account for a bloated corpse. In the end, William's funeral became the perfect metaphor for his rule. Grand intentions collapsing into chaos, divine and earthly forces warring over his legacy, and the conquered having the last bitter laugh. The monks of Keene would later rebuild his tomb, but the legend of the exploding corpse endured, ensuring that history remembered the conqueror not just for his victories, but for the grotesque poetry of his downfall. Centuries after his death, William the Conqueror's shadow still loomed over England, but whether it was seen as a guiding light or a crushing weight depended entirely on who you asked. To Tudor kings and Victorian imperialists, he was the architect of England's greatness, the strongman who replaced Saxon chaos with the foundations of centralized power. But to radicals and rebels, from Wat Tyler's peasants to Oliver Cromwell's revolutionaries, he was the original oppressor, a foreign tyrant whose conquest introduced the so-called Norman yoke, a system designed to grind the common man into submission. This wasn't just academic debate, it was a battle over England's soul, fought with ink and fire across generations. The pro-William narrative flourished among those who benefited from his legacy. The Tudor dynasty, desperate to justify their own centralized power, painted him as a unifier who dragged England out of backwardness. Historians like William Camden praised his legal reforms, crediting him with replacing tribal customs with civilized Norman law. Even the Magna Carta, that famed Charter of Liberties, owed its existence to the feudal structures William imposed. Without his rigid hierarchy, would English barons have ever united to challenge King John? By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume argued that William's conquest had saved England from Viking domination, forging a nation strong enough to build an empire. Yet for every voice praising William, another spat venom. The Norman yoke theory, first whispered in medieval taverns, became a rallying cry for dissent. Medieval peasants, chafing under serfdom, traced their bondage directly to 1066. When Wat Tyler's rebels stormed London in 1381, they demanded a return to Saxon laws imagined as a golden age of equality before the Normans came. Centuries later, radicals like John Lilburne used the same argument against Charles I, branding monarchy itself as a Norman imposition. Even the Levellers, those fiery idealists of the English Civil War, claimed they weren't revolutionaries but restorers, throwing off the yoke William had clamped upon their ancestors. The irony is thick enough to carve with a sword. William, a man who cared little for public opinion, became a mirror for every era's hopes and grudges. Romantic poets like Wordsworth mourned the lost Saxon freedom, while imperialists applauded his iron-fisted efficiency. Modern historians, armed with economic data, debate whether the conquest enriched or impoverished England, some pointing to the Domesday Book's evidence of widespread devastation, others to the burst of cathedral building and trade that followed. Perhaps the most revealing twist came in 1966, the 900th anniversary of Hastings. England's establishment celebrated with reenactments and documentaries, framing William as the founder of national identity. Meanwhile, a fringe group called the Saxon Liberation Army bombed a Norman church in York, proving that for some, the wounds of conquest never fully healed. Today, as scholars reassess colonialism's scars, the Norman yoke narrative resurfaces in new forms, a reminder that history's verdicts are never final, only endlessly rewritten by those who still feel the weight of the past. William's legacy wasn't just written in the stone of English castles. It was etched into the very soil of Normandy, the land where his story began. Yet within a century and a half of his death, the duchy he'd fought so fiercely to secure would slip from his descendants' grasp, severing England from its Norman origins in a twist of history as dramatic as the conquest itself. The unraveling began with William's own fractured family. His decision to split his empire, Normandy for Robert, England for William Rufus, planted the seeds of future conflict. Robert's weak rule in Normandy left the duchy vulnerable, and when his younger brother Henry I seized England's crown after Rufus's mysterious hunting accident, he wasted no time invading Normandy to reunite his father's domains. The decisive Battle of Tinchebray in 1106 saw Robert captured and imprisoned for life, his son exiled. Henry now ruled both sides of the Channel, but the victory came at a cost. Normandy's independence was eroding, its fate increasingly tied to England's throne. Then came the anarchy, a 19-year civil war between Henry's daughter Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois. While they tore England apart, Normandy became a battleground for French opportunists. King Louis VII of France, sensing weakness, nibbled at the edges, claiming castles and sowing dissent among Norman barons. By the time Matilda's son Henry II took power in 1154, restoring order required more than military might, it demanded diplomacy. His marriage to Elena of Aquitaine created an Angevin empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but this vast realm was held together by little more than Henry's iron will. The cracks became chasms under Henry's sons. Richard the Lionheart, though a brilliant warrior, spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, bleeding the treasury dry for crusades and continental wars. His brother John, inheriting a bankrupt kingdom and resentful barons, proved catastrophically inept. When Philip II of France, a cunning strategist nicknamed Augustus, declared Normandy forfeit in 1202, John's response was a mix of hesitation and blunder. He failed to rally Norman loyalty, lost key allies through petty grudges, and watched helplessly as Philip's forces besieged castle after castle. The final blow came at Château-Gaillard in 1204, the impregnable fortress Richard had built on the Seine. After a brutal 6-month siege, its starving defenders surrendered, and Normandy, the cradle of William's dynasty, was lost forever. The consequences rippled through history. England's nobility, once holding lands on both sides of the Channel, now had to swear allegiance to Philip or lose their French estates overnight. The English language, long suppressed in aristocratic circles, began its slow climb back to prominence. Most ironically, the loss forced England to look inward, fostering a distinct national identity separate from its Norman roots. William's descendants, who'd once ruled as French-speaking outsiders, now had to become truly English kings, yet the ghost of Normandy never fully departed. The Tower of London still stood as a Norman artifact, the legal system bore William's imprint, and the aristocracy's French-infused language endured. Even today, the Bayeux Tapestry, that triumphant Norman propaganda, hangs not in England but in France, a silent reminder of how quickly the tides of conquest can turn. William's dream of a cross-channel empire died with John's failures, but the paradox endures. The very act of losing Normandy finally made England English. Beneath the soil of English battlefields and the stones of Norman castles lies another kind of evidence hidden in the bloodlines of millions. Modern genetics has uncovered something astonishing. Nearly 1 in 4 people of English descent carry DNA markers linking them directly to William's Norman invaders. But it's not just any DNA, these are the genetic fingerprints of a conquest that reshaped a nation. The science is as precise as it is startling. In a landmark study published in 2008, researchers analyzed why chromosome markers passed virtually unchanged from father to son across the British Isles. They found a distinct genetic cluster closely matching populations in northern France, particularly Normandy, the timing of its arrival around the 11th century. The distribution overwhelmingly concentrated among families with historical ties to landholdings dating back to the Norman elite. In other words, the descendants of those who rode with William still walk among the English today. But the real surprise came when they zoomed in on the aristocracy. Old surnames tied to Domesday book entries, names like Percy, Montgomery, and Warren, showed Norman DNA markers at rates approaching 50%. Some lineages, like the descendants of the notorious Marcher lords who policed Wales, carried nearly identical Y chromosomes to modern Normans. It's as if the pages of history books had come alive in their veins. This genetic legacy isn't just about nobility, though. The study revealed a ripple effect: Norman DNA gradually mixing into the broader population through centuries of social mobility, intermarriage, and yes, less savory interactions. Regions closest to Norman castles and cathedrals, like Kent and East Anglia, showed the highest concentrations, while Celtic strongholds in Cornwall and Wales remained virtual genetic islands. Yet the story isn't one way. English DNA left its mark on Normandy too. Records from medieval Rouen mention Saxon slaves brought back after the harrying of the north, their genes quietly assimilating into French lineages. Modern geneticists have even traced rare English haplogroups in Norman fishing villages, likely the silent descendants of those long-ago captives. What does this mean for how we see the conquest? It shatters the old myth of Normans as a tiny foreign elite ruling from isolated castles. Their blood, and by extension, their influence, permeated English society far deeper than anyone imagined. Every time someone with Norman DNA walks past the Tower of London or traces their family tree to a Domesday record, they're living proof that history isn't just written in parchment or stone. It's written in the very building blocks of life, a 900-year-old whisper in the double helix. Walk into any courtroom in England or America today, and you'll hear the ghosts of the conquest whispering in every legal phrase. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant pleads not guilty. Justice must prevail. These aren't just English words. They're linguistic artifacts of Norman rule, fossilized into the language of power. When William's scribes drafted laws, they didn't bother translating French terms for Saxon peasants. Why would they? The language of authority wasn't meant to be understood by the conquered. 1,000 years later, we're still living with that hierarchy baked into the very words we use to govern ourselves. Take something as simple as food. Saxon farmers tending livestock in the fields kept their old English names for animals: cow, sheep, pig. But when those animals became dishes on a Norman lord's table, they transformed into French delicacies: beef from boeuf, mutton from mountain, pork from pork. This wasn't just a quirk of vocabulary, it was a caste system encoded in syllables. The laborers spoke of the living creature in their guttural tongue, the elites dined on its flesh in theirs. Nowhere was this linguistic apartheid more glaring than in law and governance. Anglo-Saxon terms like Falkland and thing, their word for a judicial assembly vanished, replaced by French imports like property and parliament. The very word government comes from the Old French governor, a verb meaning to steer, as if the state were a ship and only Norman hands could grip the tiller. Even basic legal concepts split along class lines. A Saxon wrong became a Norman tort, a theft turned into larceny, and oath-breaking morphed into the fancier perjury. The message was clear: justice might be blind, but she only spoke French. The ripple effects are staggering. Modern English has two words for nearly every concept, one blunt and Germanic, the other refined and Latinate. We ask from Old English but demand from French. We smell flowers but scent perfumes. This duality gives English its remarkable richness, but it also betrays its violent birth. Writers from Shakespeare to Orwell have exploited this split, using Anglo-Saxon words for raw emotion, love, hate, blood, and French-derived terms for cold abstraction, emotion, desire, sanguine. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the halls of power. The British Parliament still opens each session with the Norman French phrase, La Reine le veut, the Queen wills it, a ceremonial echo of when laws were proclaimed in a language most couldn't comprehend. American legal briefs are larded with terms like force majeure and habeas corpus, untranslated relics of Norman legalism. Even the word royal comes from the French roy, while the Saxon equivalent, kingly, fell into obscurity. Yet language, like people, resists absolute control. Over centuries, English didn't just absorb French, it digested it, merging the two into something wholly new. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in Middle English 300 years after Hastings, shows the transformation in action. His Pilgrim's Knight, Miller, wife of Bath, speak in a vibrant mix of both tongues, a linguistic melting pot that would one day give the world everything from Shakespearean sonnets to hip-hop lyrics. The ultimate irony, Norman French, imposed as a tool of oppression, eventually died out in England. By the 14th century, even the nobility had switched to English, albeit an English forever changed by its conquerors. Today, when a British Prime Minister rises in Parliament or an American judge pounds a gavel, they're unwitting actors in a drama William set in motion. The words may have lost their foreign accent, but the power structures they describe remain, etched into the language like scars that never quite fade. Standing before Durham Cathedral, you're not just looking at a place of worship, you're staring at a declaration of dominance carved in stone. William's architects didn't just build churches, they engineered awe. The ribbed vaults soaring overhead weren't merely structural innovations, they were psychological weapons, their dizzying heights meant to humble Saxon worshippers into submission. Every element whispered Norman supremacy, the rounded arches copied from Roman triumphs, the thick walls that could double as fortifications, the strategic placement on cliff edges where they loomed over towns like watchful giants. These weren't cathedrals, they were stone propaganda. Take Chepstow Castle, perched on its sheer limestone cliffs above the River Wye. The first Norman fortress built in Wales wasn't just a military base, it was a theatre of intimidation. Visitors approaching its great tower had to navigate a deliberately narrow doorway, forcing even kings to dismount and enter single file, instantly stripped of dignity. The interior walls were once plastered and painted vivid colors, a flamboyant display of wealth meant to dazzle or dismay local Welsh chieftains. Meanwhile, arrow slits were designed not just for defense, but to allow dozens of archers to train their bows on anyone daring to approach a silent, deadly welcome committee. The genius of Norman architecture lay in its dual purpose. Monastic chronicles describe how William's builders often worked on castles and cathedrals simultaneously, sometimes using the same stone quarries. At Norwich, the cathedral's exact height matched the castle keep across town, a visual balance between cross and crown. In London, the tower's White Tower housed both a throne room and a chapel, blending earthly and divine authority under one roof. Even the building materials told a story. Keen stone, imported at great cost from Normandy, gleamed cream white against England's duller local stone, making Norman structures literally shine brighter on the landscape. Look closer at Durham's nave and you'll spot something startling: chevron patterns zigzagging like frozen lightning around the pillars. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a visual metaphor for the Norman commitment to order. While Saxon churches had favored organic, irregular carvings, Norman masons imposed geometric precision, their chisels carving the chaos of conquest into perfect symmetry. The message was clear: just as these stones obeyed the architect's rule, so too must England obey its new masters. Even the cathedral's stained glass, now lost to time, originally depicted Norman saints triumphing over Anglo-Saxon ones, a celestial coup d'etat in colored light. Perhaps the most sinister stroke was how these buildings manipulated movement. Westminster Abbey's original Norman layout forced pilgrims to walk past the tombs of conquering kings before reaching the shrine of Edward the Confessor, subtly reinforcing the new dynasty's legitimacy. At Castle Rising in Norfolk, visitors ascending to the Great Hall had to pass through a cramped stairwell that suddenly opened into a vast, glittering space, a physical metaphor for the transition from Saxon oppression to Norman splendor. These weren't just buildings, they were carefully choreographed experiences designed to rewrite collective memory. The surviving fragments of Norman wall paintings reveal the final piece of this architectural intimidation. In the Priory of St. Gabriel in Cambridge, a faded but still visible fresco shows the Archangel Michael, patron saint of Normandy, weighing souls on Judgment Day. Notably, the damned figures bear distinct Anglo-Saxon hairstyles and tunics. This wasn't subtle. By blending religious imagery with political messaging, William's builders made divine judgment and Norman rule indistinguishable. To reject the Conqueror wasn't just treason, it was heresy. Centuries later, these structures still dominate skylines, their very endurance a testament to William's vision. The Saxons built mostly in wood, the Normans built in stone to last 1,000 years. Every courthouse with Romanesque columns, every university building with rounded arches, even modern banks designed like fortress towers, they're all unconscious heirs to Norman architectural propaganda. The stones may have weathered, but their message remains carved deep into England's bones. Power belongs to those who can shape the very earth beneath their feet. William the Conqueror stands at the center of a historical divide as deep as the trenches his armies dug at Hastings. To some, he was the architect of modern England, a ruler who replaced Saxon fragmentation with strong centralized governance, laying foundations for everything from common law to parliamentary systems. To others, he remains a butcher who unleashed fire and sword upon the north, methodically erasing Anglo-Saxon identity in a campaign that borders on cultural genocide. The truth, as always, refuses to sit neatly on either side of the battlefield. Consider the case for William as state builder. Before his invasion, England was a patchwork of earldoms where local lords often wielded more power than the king. The old Anglo-Saxon monarchy had no standing army, no unified tax system, and no way to enforce laws beyond the reach of a horse's gallop. William changed all that. The Domesday Book wasn't just a tax ledger. It was the birth certificate of bureaucratic government, a masterstroke of administrative control that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. His feudal system, though harsh by modern standards, brought stability after generations of Viking raids and civil wars. Even the church reforms, for all their brutality, dragged English monasteries out of isolation and into the intellectual currents of medieval Europe. As historian David Bates argues, without William's iron framework, England might never have coalesced into a nation capable of resisting future French or Spanish conquests. Yet the counterarguments are written in the scorched earth of Yorkshire and the pages of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The harrying of the North wasn't just wartime devastation, it was calculated terror. Modern climate studies of tree rings from the period show a sudden, dramatic drop in growth around 1069, matching contemporary accounts of famine so severe that starving villagers turned to cannibalism. When the Domesday book later recorded vast tracts as waste, it wasn't hyperbole. Entire regions had been depopulated. Some scholars, like historian William Capel, estimate the death toll at over 100,000 in a country of barely 2 million. That's proportionally worse than the Black Death. Even William's apologist, Bishop William of Poitiers, conceded the king punished the innocent with the guilty, a rare medieval admission of collective punishment. The debate takes on new shades when viewed through modern ethical lenses. Contemporary historians like Mark Morris tread carefully, acknowledging both William's administrative genius and the horror of his methods. The harrying, once dismissed as exaggerated medieval propaganda, is now recognized through soil samples and skeletal remains as a systematic scorched earth campaign. But was it genocide? Scholars hesitate at the term, not because the suffering wasn't immense, but because medieval warfare had different rules, massacres like the St. Bryce's Day killings under Saxon King Ethelred show pre-Norman brutality wasn't unknown. Yet the scale and precision of William's retaliation stand apart. Perhaps the most balanced view comes from the landscape itself. Walk through York's narrow streets where Viking and Saxon once mingled, and you'll find Norman arches towering over both. The English language, though nearly strangled in aristocratic circles, eventually swallowed its French invaders whole, emerging richer for the struggle. Even the harrying's wastelands eventually rebounded, their soil nourished by ash and blood. William's legacy isn't a binary of hero or monster, it's the uncomfortable truth that history's greatest transformations often rise from foundations of suffering. The England we know was forged in that fire, its identity shaped as much by resistance as by surrender. Hollywood has never known quite what to do with William the Conqueror, whether to paint him as a brooding hero or a snarling villain. Take the 1966 film The Conqueror, starring John Wayne in one of the most baffling casting choices of all time. Squinting through a fur-trimmed tunic with his signature cowboy drawl, Wayne's William feels less like a medieval duke and more like a ranch hand who wandered onto the wrong set. The film, famously shot downwind of nuclear test sites, somehow managed to be more radioactive in its storytelling than its location, rewriting history into a clunky romance where William falls for a Tartar princess who never existed. Critics panned it, audiences avoided it, and even Wayne later called it his worst mistake, yet it cemented a pop culture trope, the Conqueror as a brute with more brawn than brains. For a sharper take, Georgette Heyer's 1931 novel The Conqueror presents William as a complex strategist, his ambition tempered by genuine affection for Matilda. Heyer, better known for Regency romances, delved deep into Norman chronicles, crafting a William who quotes Latin, frets over supply lines, and wages psychological warfare long before arrows fly at Hastings. The book's most revealing moment comes when William, fresh from his coronation, overhears Saxon nobles mocking his bastard birth. Instead of erupting in rage, he coldly calculates how to use their contempt against them, a scene that captures the real conqueror's blend of insecurity and genius. Video games take yet another angle. In Civilization VI, William appears as a steely-eyed tactician whose special ability, Norman Might, grants bonuses for conquering foreign cities. It's a sanitized version of the harrying of the North, repackaged as tidy game mechanics. More intriguing is Crusader Kings Roman III, where players can rewrite history, siding with Harold at Hastings or even preventing the Norman invasion altogether. These digital depictions highlight a tension. Is William the unstoppable force of progress, or just one roll of history's dice? The most fascinating twist comes from children's media. The British cartoon Horrible Histories plays William for laughs, showing him tripping over his coronation robe while Saxons jeer. Yet even here the subtext lingers, his humiliation fuels his ruthlessness. Meanwhile, a French comic book series, Les Rois Maudits, frames him as a visionary burdened by the weight of destiny, a stark contrast to England's frequent portrayal of him as a thief in armor. What unites all these interpretations is their struggle with the same question historians face. Was William's violence a necessary cost of nation-building or the mark of a tyrant? Pop culture's answer shifts with the times. In eras valuing strong leaders, he's a hero. In periods wary of imperialism, he's a villain. The real William, as always, remains just out of reach, his legend as contested today as the field of Hastings was in 1066. 21 years, that's all it took for William the Conqueror to reshape England into something utterly unrecognizable to the people who had once called it home. By the time of his death in 1087, the kingdom he left behind wasn't Anglo-Saxon or Norman. It was a strange, uneasy hybrid, a melting pot of two worlds forced together under the pressure of his iron will. And the fusion he created didn't just flicker out with his dynasty. It became the bedrock of everything England would later become. Take the legal system. Before William, justice was local, rooted in community assemblies and regional customs, but the Conqueror's ironclad feudalism centralized power in ways that still echo today. The idea that all land ultimately belongs to the crown, that's William. The concept of a unified legal code enforced by royal courts, that's William too. Even modern property law traces its ancestry back to the Domesday book's meticulous records, where every acre was catalogued like spoils of war. Some historians argue that without this brutal streamlining, England might never have developed the strong, centralized state that later birthed the Magna Carta, or even the parliamentary system. Then there's the language. Walk into any English courtroom today, and you'll hear the ghost of Norman oppression in every phrase. Plaintiff, defendant, judgment. These aren't just words, they're linguistic shackles, remnants of a time when French was the tongue of power and Old English was banished to the fields. Yet this forced marriage of languages gave English its incredible richness. The duality of begin, Germanic versus commence, French, freedom versus liberty, created a vocabulary capable of Shakespearean depth and scientific precision. The very words you're hearing now are haunted by William's conquest, but the most controversial legacy lies in the social fabric. The Anglo-Saxon concept of free men owning land vanished under Norman feudalism, replaced by a rigid hierarchy where peasants toiled as serfs bound to their lords. The forest laws that turned hunting into a capital offense for commoners, the brutal punishments for dissent, these weren't just policies. They were cultural grenades lobbed into the heart of Saxon society. Some economists argue this oppression laid the groundwork for England's later class divides, while others counter that the stability William imposed allowed trade and cities to flourish. And yet, for all the bloodshed, something remarkable emerged from the ashes. The Anglo-Norman fusion birthed a new identity, one that absorbed Saxon resilience and Norman ambition to eventually forge an empire. The Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, even the English language itself are monuments to this uneasy synthesis. The real question isn't just whether William changed England, it's whether the England we know could have existed without him. So what do you think? Would England have been better off without 1066? Would the Saxons have built their own centralized state or fractured under Viking invasions? Could English still have become a global language without that French infusion? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've enjoyed this deep dive into history's most pivotal invasion, don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the past. After all, as William proved, the echoes of a single battle can ripple for 1,000 years.